There is a specific kind of silence that only exists at 3 o'clock in the morning. It isn't just the absence of noise, it's a heavy, pressurized stillness that feels like the world is holding its breath. For most of us, this is the hour of deep sleep, a time when our minds are wandering through the hazy landscapes of dreams. But for some, this is the hour when the veil between what we know and what we fear becomes dangerously thin. We tell ourselves that our bedrooms are sanctuaries. We lock our doors, we draw our curtains, and we find comfort in the familiar shapes of our furniture. The wardrobe in the corner, the desk against the wall, the padded storage bench at the foot of the bed. But what happens when those familiar shapes change? What happens when the person you expect to see in the bed next to yours simply isn't there? And in their place, something else is waiting. Something solid, something silent, and something that lacks the one thing we need to see to feel human, a face. Tonight, we're looking into a case that defies the standard rules of shadow people and spirits. It's a story of a white silhouette, a black void, and a sister who vanished into the dark while an intruder sat just inches away. This isn't just a ghost story. It's a documentation of an encounter that left a physical mark and a psychological scar that hasn't faded in over a decade. If you've ever woken up with the feeling that you're being watched, you might want to leave the lights on for this one, because once you see what's sitting on the bench, you can never unsee it. The setting is a shared bedroom, typical of any suburban home. Two sisters, the younger one just 9 years old, or sleeping in the same room they've known for years. It's a space filled with the clutter of childhood, toys, blankets, and a padded storage bench at the end of the room. It's a room that should be safe, but safety is an illusion that can be shattered by a single sound. On this particular night, a sound woke the older sister. It wasn't a loud bang or a scream. Perhaps it was just the rustle of fabric or the shifting of weight on wood. She sat up, her eyes adjusting to the dim moonlight filtering through the window. Her gaze fell on that padded storage bench. There was a figure sitting there. At first, the mind does what it always does. It tries to rationalize. She thought it was her sister. Maybe the 9-year-old couldn't sleep. Maybe she was just sitting there, lost in a late-night thought. She called her name once, twice. There was no answer. The figure didn't turn. It didn't speak. It just sat. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had come before. It was active. It was heavy. The older sister looked toward her sister's bed, expecting to see a familiar lump under the covers, but the bed was empty. The blankets were tossed aside, and the space where her sister should have been was cold. The realization began to crawl up her spine like a freezing hand. If her sister wasn't in bed, then who or what was sitting on that bench? She looked back at the figure. In the dark, it was starkly white, not transparent like a movie ghost, not misty or ethereal, but solid. It had the mass and presence of a living human being. But as she squinted, trying to make out the features, she saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. There was no face where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. There was only a black space, a void. It was as if someone had cut a hole out of reality and stitched it onto the head of this white entity. The contrast was sickening. A bright, solid white body topped with a face made of pure, absolute nothingness. It was looking in her direction, but without eyes. The look felt more like a predatory focus. Then it started to move. The entity wasn't just sitting still. Its arms were in motion. It was gesturing, moving its hands and limbs in a rhythmic, abstract way. But there was no sound, no rustle of clothing, no creak from the padded bench. It was a silent performance of the uncanny. This is the point where most people would scream, but the witness describes a sensation that is even more terrifying than fear. After staring at the faceless figure for about 2 to 3 minutes, an overwhelming feeling of exhaustion suddenly washed over her. This wasn't a natural tiredness. It was a heavy, sudden weight that forced her eyes closed. She fell back into her bed, unable to fight the sleep. When she woke up the next morning, she was slumped over in the exact same sitting position she had been in when she saw the entity. Something was wrong. She realized she had wet the bed, something that hadn't happened since she was 3 years old. The trauma of the encounter had manifested physically, and her sister sister was still gone. Panicked, she ran to her parents' room. There, she found her 9-year-old sister huddled in their bed. Her parents explained that the little girl had come running into their room earlier that night, absolutely terrified, saying there was a ghost in their bedroom. When the two sisters finally talked, the younger one described the exact same thing: a solid white figure with a black void for a face. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't a dream. This was a shared reality. To understand what happened that night, we have to look at the anatomy of this entity. In the world of the paranormal, we often talk about shadow people, pitch black silhouettes that hide in corners. But this was a white shadow. These entities are rare and often described as being stark white or having a silver-white glow. Unlike dark shadows, which are often associated with negative emotions like depression or sickness, white shadows are sometimes seen as kind souls or even guardian ancestors. But the entity on the bench didn't feel like a guardian. It felt intense and mysterious. And then there's that black facial void. Witnesses of similar entities describe the face as being blacker than black, like looking into a pitch black dark room where there is a total lack of face. This facial void triggers a primal fight or flight response in the human brain because we are hardwired to read social cues from faces. When that face is replaced by nothingness, our psyche experiences a form of existential vertigo. But why was the sister missing from her bed? This brings us to the phenomenon of the mimic. Mimics are entities capable of assuming the physical presence or general shape of a loved one. In many cases, a witness will interact with a mimic for minutes, believing it to be a family member, only to realize the real person is elsewhere. In this case, the entity positioned itself on the storage bench, a place where a sibling might sit to talk. It effectively replaced the sister's presence in the room, holding the space until the observer realized the bed was empty. This displacement is a recurring theme in high strangeness reports, where children are lured or scared out of their beds by entities that then take up residence in the room. There's also the question of the furniture itself. Why the storage bench? Paranormal research suggests that spirits can attach to specific objects, especially those that have absorbed significant emotional energy over years of use. Padded benches and chairs at the foot of a bed are often cited as anchors for manifestations. Some spiritualists believe that leaving a chair facing a bed serves as an invitation for a spirit to sit and watch the sleeper. The storage bench in that bedroom provided a primary observation deck for the entity. By sitting there, it claimed the territory of the room, using the furniture as a stage for its silent, rhythmic arm movements. Could there be a scientific explanation? Sleep researchers often point to sleep paralysis, a state where you are awake but your body is paralyzed as if still in a dream. During these episodes, people often report a sensed presence or a figure sitting on the end of their bed. But this case breaks the rules of sleep paralysis. The witness was able to sit up. She was able to call out her sister's name. Most importantly, her sister saw the entity too. This wasn't a brain glitch. It was an event. The sudden exhaustion and the bedwetting are markers of a stage 6 poltergeist climax, a point where the energy in a room reaches a fever pitch, causing physical reactions in the witnesses. The white faceless entity is a mystery that has persisted for decades. These figures follow people from house to house, appearing once a year or staying for a single terrifying night to let you know that you are not as alone as you think. They don't always want to hurt you, but they want to be seen. They want you to know that the world you think you understand is just a thin layer of ice over a very deep, very cold ocean. If you're watching this and you have a padded bench at the end of your bed or a chair that faces your pillows, you might want to turn it around tonight. Think about the objects in your room. How much emotional energy have they absorbed? What stories are they keeping? The next time you wake up and see a figure sitting at the foot of your bed, don't just call out a name. Look at the face. Because if there's nothing there but a black space and the room is filled with a heavy, unnatural silence, you aren't just looking at a ghost, you're looking at a void, and the void is looking back.